will be called a Nazarene. The word of the Lord. I don't know about y'all, but sometimes when I read or hear scriptures like that, I kind of wonder to myself, why is this story here? It seems sort of odd. It's a story about moving and traveling, and it only appears in Matthew's gospel. It doesn't appear in any of the other gospels like many of the other stories of Jesus traveling. And so if you're a curious mind like my mind is, you want to know, hey, there's probably something more to this. Let's take a look. And the first thing that we have to remember is what was going on in the world that Matthew was writing to and about. And so one of the first things they teach us in seminary about scriptural interpretation is you have to ask yourself, how would the folks that heard this firsthand have interpreted it? So I'll remind you, we're in a time that's coming past what in our Bibles would be called the Old Testament. For thousands of years, there were prophets talking about God's coming kingdom, how God would restore creation. We heard about great heroes, some of which were mentioned in our Christmas proclamation this morning. But then about 400 years ago, the prophets went silent. And God's people, the people of Israel, the people who had been promised that restoration and a new creation would be born in and through them, thought God had left them. They hadn't heard from God in over 400 years. And into that world, then, a child is born. A child is born in a manger. And everybody from the shepherds to the magi are saying, this is the Messiah. But many of these followers of God still wondered. So I'll remind you this morning that Matthew's gospel, when you see things in Matthew's gospel, his gospel was written to a Jewish audience. So in many ways, Matthew will try to connect their history to what's happening in Jesus. In other ways, Matthew will make statements as if we all know about Jewish traditions that made perfect sense to the first century audience, but might slip right past us unless we dive a little deeper. So let me give you an example of that. There were 3 parts in our gospel reading today. The first part, Joseph in a dream gets told, wake up, Herod's coming for your child, go to Egypt, in order to fulfill the prophecy, and then a prophecy is stated. Now, Matthew doesn't say who the prophet was. It was Hosea, and that prophecy really was meant initially for something that happened back in Hosea's time, but Matthew is saying, hey, look, in case you missed this, let me take you back to your history, to the scripture that you've looked at and heard throughout your life, and show you how this child fulfills this prophecy. And then the next piece, Herod getting angry that the Magi don't come back, and he keeps hearing about this Messiah, this child, and puts out the proclamation to go kill all of the infants 2 years old and younger in Bethlehem in order to fulfill the prophecy of Jeremiah. So again, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew's connecting those pieces together, what they had learned all their life to what was going on. And finally, Joseph hears another dream. Herod is dead. You can go back to Judea. But then as he's going back, he hears in a dream that, wait a minute, Herod's brother is doing the same thing, is still hunting, and it's threatened by this new child, the Messiah. So don't go back to Jerusalem, go back to Judea and go to Nazareth. And Matthew finishes that sentence by saying, so that what the prophets predicted would be true. So know that Matthew is connecting those pieces together. He's trying to say, it's not the way you expected, but let me show you how God's story continues from what you knew to what you're seeing firsthand. Now, there's another part of this that might go right by us if we're not really paying attention. But let's go back for a minute. Think, say, 10 to 13 centuries before. Do you remember a story about a hero of the faith coming to a leadership position in Egypt, so much so that Pharaoh, in this case, gets really worried about that and decides to go have children killed as well? And then that hero leads his people out of Egypt. Anybody remember that story? Moses? So one of the other things that Matthew is trying to do, and often today we miss this completely, Matthew's showing the people that this Christ child will grow into be the new Moses. And so he tells these stories in his gospel to make a parallel, to have them think back and go, wait a minute, we've heard that story before. And setting up Christ as the new Moses. So that's another great example where we may not have caught that nuance in the scripture reading, but Matthew's audience very clearly recognized that there was another dynamic here at play, another way Matthew was trying to show that this child born in a manger was the Messiah. And you know, it's not surprising. We've heard it through Christmas time. We hear it each year that what the people thought the Messiah would be, a military ruler, was not that at all. It was a child in a manger. And this child in a manger didn't come to overthrow military powers. He came to bring peace and wholeness and shalom. Shalom, by the way, as David mentioned before, is a really rich word that means wholeness and restoration, right relationship with God. This child in a manger that came to say, wait a minute, the rich people and the privileged folks aren't first in God's new kingdom. The poor, the outcasts, the widows, the orphans are first in line. This child in a manger came to show us that we should love our neighbors. This child in a manger came to say God's kingdom is breaking through, and he invited all of his hearers throughout his ministry. Jesus invited folks to follow him. And what he meant was, do the things I'm suggesting you do, act the way I am acting, because it's radically different than how the people around him were living. And so then the question we have to ask ourselves this morning is, how does that apply to us? That's that second question we're taught in seminary. How would then the audience have heard this story and thought about it? And then what's relevant about it for us today? And I think the answer is that God's kingdom continues to come all around us. Now, God, to be clear, does not need us for God's kingdom to come, but God invites us, that as Jesus did in his ministry and as his life example, to be part of God's kingdom coming here in this community all around us. We're called to live our lives so that others in the community say, there's something different about those people. Sometimes different is good. In fact, in a lot of cases, different is good. We're called to live our lives so that people around us go, why do you open your church for the community to use when they need a place to meet? Or why do you show up at the Woodlands Pride? Aren't you a church? Yes. Why do you love radically no matter what somebody's circumstances? Because we were called to love. Why do we go to Terry's table and help in food pantries and collect Christmas gifts for kids in foster care in Montgomery County? Because we're called to be shalom bringers. And so my question to y'all today, as we sit here in the last Sunday of 2025, think of all the ways that we have come together as a community to bring wholeness, to bring restoration, to let others in Montgomery County see God's kingdom breaking through in us. Let's keep doing those things, by the way. And then in 2026, starting just next week, how can we further as Spirit of Joy, and all of you online, by the way, wherever it is you are, how can we bring wholeness and restoration and healing to our communities? And one way I'm going to suggest, and I'll just give you a highlight that it's coming, is Pastor David has asked me to do a book study early in 2026 where we're going to look at who our neighbors are and talk about bringing the kingdom to our neighbors in our literal neighborhoods. The folks that live right around you, wherever it is you live, how can we be a neighbor to them and show love and hope and restoration? And that's my gift, because if we do that, God's story continues through and in us here at Spirit of Joy. And let the angels rejoice at that thought. Would you stand as you're able and sing with us?